everyone, and welcome to another community conversation on the health crisis at
of personnel.
That's a great
Another
question,
element
and I would
respond
direct them
well.
to
We're
red
thinking outside the box, trying to come up with new ways
And
of
as
moving.
you already mentioned, the city is
Let's try to keep these numbers from doubling.
At over 33%.
I'm glad I hope you're watching at home.
First, I want to say thank you for inviting me to the show.
Hello, everybody. It's Friday, just afternoon, so it must be time for another community conversation right here on Facebook Live. Thanks for joining us. Today's topic is historic preservation in the city of Harrisburg, and it's a topic that really came to the forefront of our public discussion a little bit ago when we tragically lost the Jackson House Hotel on 6th Street. As a part of Jackson Square. That was a building that had, unfortunately, despite its rich history and great historical contribution to the city, it had been neglected for over a generation. And despite valiant efforts by a team to try and restore it, it collapsed rather dramatically amidst those reservation efforts. It was a contributing historical structure to the city. It is no more. Perhaps it will be able to be rebuilt or reconstructed, but really it's a cautionary tale about how if we don't protect our historic buildings, we may lose them. And this is a tale which is playing out throughout Harrisburg. We've got major properties such as the William Penn campus, the State Hospital grounds, all of which were recently named key preservation priorities by Historic Harrisburg, in part because they're for sale, they will be redeveloped, and the question is, will that historical character be lost? We're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about our Historic Harrisburg Architecture Review Board, the transfer of the Harrisburg City Archives to the new State Archives building, which is being built up on 6th Street, and much more. But before we get into those topics, I just want to start with a few general announcements. It was a snowy week, as all of you know, here in Harrisburg. We survived another snowstorm. Our Public Works team worked very hard, off and on, through many shifts in a storm that seemed to never want to end. We're recovering now, and this is as good a time as any to remind everyone to please continue to follow the street sweeping signs, which means you do need to move your car, even when we're not street sweeping. Follow the posted signs, and part of the reason that you need to follow the posted signs is if you move your car, especially in a snowstorm, our plows are going to be able to get down the street more easily. They're going to be able to plow closer to the curb, and it's going to make life easier for your fellow neighbors. If you don't move your car, not only will you get a ticket, which will frustrate you, but the plows won't be able to get down, and everyone will lose. So that, in a nutshell, especially for snow, is why you need to follow the street sweeping signs. But it's also true that even when we're not doing street sweeping, oftentimes we will schedule other types of maintenance and activities, everything from still picking up, yard waste at other times of years to scheduling repairs for light poles or concrete work or utility work. So follow the street sweeping signs. This issue comes up every year, and street sweeping will be back as the weather permits. Also want to let everybody know that today was a big day for Harrisburg because it was the first day that we picked up the trash and recyclables for the municipality of Paxtang. Welcome, Paxtang, to our sort of multi-municipality group that Harrisburg is servicing, along with Pembroke and Steelton. The collection went very well. I just spoke to Aaron Johnson, took about 5 hours. We serviced the residents of Paxtang, and this is a new intergovernmental agreement that can last up to 5 years, and I think should be of great benefit to their residents because we're able to offer them a lower cost in the private sector, as well as our residents because we're being able to bring in income, which is going to help improve our capacity. We'll be able to hire new people, as we have, and while they'll be helping Paxtang 1 day a week, they'll be in Harrisburg working for the other 4. So it's a great thing, these intergovernmental agreements, and I wanted to announce that Paxtang just began today here in early February. Pembroke had already begun in January. Another general announcement, we have Harrisburg City Council coming back and coming back strong. We had we recently had a work session on the affordable housing legislation that went very well and holds a lot of promise, I think, for the city. The next regularly scheduled council meeting is actually going to be this Tuesday, February 9th at 6 p.m. Now, again, these are virtual sessions due to the pandemic, but you can register, you can view them, and you can comment in person. So we hope you will do that. And coming up next, not only will we have more affordable housing discussions, but City Council has agreed to begin their hearings on the new comprehensive plan. We're very excited about this. It's been a long time in the making. And there will be at least 3 planned comprehensive plan discussions on Wednesdays, Wednesday, February 17th, February 24th, and then 2 weeks after that on March 10th, all at 6 p.m., and each one tackling different parts of the comprehensive plan. Now, you can learn more about the plan, and you can get the details for how to join at harrisburgpa.gov/compplan. There's also a terrific online Facebook discussion that happens every Sunday about the comp plans that is currently underway in Harrisburg. You can check that out as well. There are a lot of really good resources that should help you be informed. The plan was drafted by the Harrisburg Planning Commission, who worked with a number of different consultants and incorporated a lot of feedback. City Council's job is to hear the plan and potentially propose amendments to the plan so that we will hopefully have a ratified comprehensive plan here before the summer. So join those upcoming conversations, and they should be vigorous ones. All right, well, now to the topic at hand and historic preservation. We talked a little bit about, I talked a little bit first about Jackson House and then about William Penn and the State Hospital grounds. Other buildings, notable buildings in the city that we should remember have to do with, for instance, the Methodist churches, which were shuttered last year by the Methodist Conference. Many of them are very historic and currently for sale. That includes Grace, which was once the site of the Harrisburg Capital when the old Capitol burned down. It includes the Methodist Church on Derry Street and in Camp Curtin, both of whom have extraordinary architecture. We did see, rather encouragingly, our first church to residential unit development plan approved this past week, and that's for one of the old Methodist churches in Midtown. And I think it could potentially bode well for other developers taking a look at these churches and maybe adaptively reusing them in interesting ways. That's going to be a very interesting project that we'll all follow. And I just wanted to put out there as well that some of the property which is clearly for sale in Harrisburg, which is historic also, could be transformative in terms of what might eventually go in there. I think many people know that the Zembo Temple is currently for sale. There have been a lot of interest. I've met with several interested parties there that want to turn that into a more active and vibrant performance space. So is Dixon University Center, the old Harrisburg Academy up in the Riverside neighborhood, which is largely underutilized right now. But imagine if that became a campus, either a corporate campus or a new campus for students. And that could be transformative for the city. So this is why we're having this conversation. Harrisburg is really defined by its historical architecture. There's a lot of opportunity for development, and there is the potential to lose valuably contributing structures. I want to start. We have 2 guests today. We have Mr. Frank Grumbine, who is the City of Harrisburg's Historic Preservation Specialist and our archivist. And we're also joined by Khalid, who is a member of the Harrisburg Architectural Review Board. And we're going to talk to each of them a little bit. And we're going to put out a call for maybe why you might want to volunteer to get involved. There is an opening currently on that board, and let's have this conversation. And if it interests you, and you are interested in these issues and contributing and volunteering, send your resume into the city, and we will absolutely consider it, because we're looking to make sure that we have all of our boards as full as possible and with individuals that really care deeply about the issues. So, Frank, we're going to start with you. Welcome. Thanks for being here. And before we get into historic preservation, well, it's a related topic, but you're our archivist. And one of the reasons you were hired was because we were initially in the process of working out an MOU with the Commonwealth to take the historical collections of Harrisburg, the various documents that we had that really we didn't have the capacity to preserve or let alone make accessible to scholars, and transfer them to the new State Archives building, which I think many people are currently watching with great interest as the cranes build it up on North 6th Street. Can you just give people a little update on where things stand with that project?
First of all, thanks for having me. I appreciate being able to be of assistance to the residents of the city of Harrisburg and otherwise. So since 2009, we have been transferring the city archives holdings to the new state archives, well, the current state archives until the new building is constructed. I would say we are about 2/3 completed with the transfer of our holdings. Unfortunately, last year, as everyone is dealing with, the COVID pandemic impacted our ability to transfer the rest of the records. But I want to give a shout out to the State Archives staff and the State Archivist, David Carmichael, for working with us to transfer these valuable records to be publicly available to the city of Harrisburg and its residents. These records have such great value, historical value, cultural value, and it's imperative that they're publicly available for students, for scholars, for residents, and for researchers. Hopefully within the next couple months, we will be able to resume the transfer of documents to the state archives where they are currently working to catalog and digitize relevant documents and have them to be available to research online or in person. And of course, this takes time. So hopefully I know this will be a successful endeavor between the city of Harrisburg and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to help not only residents of Harrisburg, but residents of the Commonwealth to have access to these records.
Thanks for that, Frank. Yeah, and it's not just about physically preserving the records and making sure they're kept in proper conditions and they don't deteriorate and aren't lost. It's also, as you say, about digitizing them, cataloging them, making them accessible for researchers. In a nutshell, and just real quickly, can you just tell us a little bit about some of the types of records that we're talking about, so that people can understand, what it is that we're transferring?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the city archives have a wide variety of records that are housed, which will be housed in the new state archives. But the majority of them involve maps. Maps are very valuable. The early maps of Harrisburg, some of the earliest maps in Harrisburg are from the 1790s. Other records include tax rolls, property tax rolls. There are a variety of other engineering records, such as paving records, street clearance, street vacations. There are letters, there are personal manuscripts from individuals, from previous mayors and prominent Harrisburg residents. But it's interesting because there are records in the archives that one would think that don't hold a lot of value, but they have the intrinsic value of being connected to the city, and they have value to one particular individual that's doing research that might find, genealogical value in finding their ancestors lived in Harrisburg at one point. There are tons and tons of records, and it's hard to quantify the amount of holdings that the city archives have. So hopefully, once they're all transferred and available to the public, everybody will be able to do research and find out a little bit more information about the city that they love.
Thanks for that, Frank. Yeah, and a lot of talk in Harrisburg, at least, has been about artifacts and museums, and that's not exactly what we're talking about here. We're talking about the written records of life in Harrisburg. We're talking about birth records and death records. You want to go and research how the great influenza of 100 years ago affected Harrisburg? Well, this is how you can do that. But up to this point, that hasn't been possible. Pandemic aside, we don't have a reading room or a staff or the ability to really make those accessible to scholars. The State Archives will. It's going to be a beautiful building right in the heart of the city. It's something which I fought hard to make sure didn't leave the city. At one point, the state was planning to move the archives outside of the city along with the records, and now it's part of the development of Uptown, and will have a ripple effect along with the courthouse in terms of attracting new developers. That's where the affordable housing legislation comes in, because we've already had interest in taking advantage of that new legislation and in building around the archives and around the courthouse. All very good news. All right, well, thank you, Frank, for that update. And now let's talk about historic preservation. So when we talk about historic preservation, I mentioned Jackson House, I mentioned some of the preservation priorities, but in a nutshell, why is historic preservation important to you? You are, after all, our historic preservation specialist. You're our staff member to the Architectural Review Board. Make the case for why people should care about preserving our historic structures in Harrisburg.
I'm very passionate about historic preservation, and I'm glad you asked me this question. I've made historic preservation the core principle of my professional career and personal career. I take time out of my personal time to volunteer for historic preservation purposes. But overall, historic preservation is a very wide and embracing topic. But through historic preservation, we can look at history in a variety of different ways and ask different questions of the past and learn new things about our connection to the past, and ultimately learn new things about ourselves. It grounds us in reality and gives us a sense of place and purpose. Historic preservation is an important way for us to transmit our understanding of the past to the present and future generations. Current and future generations can learn much from earlier cultures that lived in Harrisburg and through its built environment, which still exists. History is definitely not a stagnant past, which some people perceive it as, but it is a dynamic presence in our lives at this very moment. The present is a product of the past, and it is important to understand our sense of time and place through these historic buildings. We are only temporary stewards of these cultural resources, just like those who came before us. Historic preservation is important because it impacts our sense of being and community and ensures that future generations can experience being a product of an intricate past. Preservation in a broad sense is a long-term maintenance program to preserve unique neighborhoods and their historic places. With our historic preservation program, changes to particular neighborhoods are calibrated and justified based on the context of the setting and the appropriateness of the change. Overall, there are a wide variety of reasons why historic preservation is important, but there are four primary reasons. One, economic stability. Historic preservation stabilizes real estate costs and is in essence a large-scale insurance policy for growth in these neighborhoods. New businesses typically prefer old buildings due to their unique materials, designs, and craftsmanship. The preservation of neighborhoods allows for businesses and individuals to have long-term plans due to the fact that neighborhoods and the building stock in these neighborhoods won't drastically change over time. The second big reason is environmental stewardship. Given our current climate crisis, it is important to understand the intrinsic value of higher quality materials in historic buildings, such as old growth lumber. Old growth lumber is from Pennsylvania's old growth forests in the 18th and 19th centuries, and those old growth forests are very sparse now. So it's important to understand the intrinsic cost and the cost of those materials that still exist. Preservation also preserves conserves resources, reduces waste, and saves money by repairing and replacing elements of existing buildings. My favorite reason for historic preservation is the sense of place and identity that historic neighborhoods and buildings give to individuals that inhabit them. People are attracted to historic buildings and historic settings. If you walk down 3rd Street or Verbeck or Boas, you get a sense of community, a sense of feeling, a sense of belonging to these places. They mean something. You can recall that when you were a child, you grew up running around on these streets and remember these buildings being a part of your memory, a part of your life. You become emotionally attached to these places, and you become there's a sense of community around these buildings, and it's almost as if they're part of your family. And the cultural and educational value of historic preservation. Historic buildings are a physical reminder of Harrisburg's complex past and Harrisburg's culture. Regret only goes one way. Hindsight is 20/20. So once an old building is gone, it is gone forever. Those materials are gone. The craftsmanship of the builder is gone. The setting and the site of that building is deteriorated. Historic communities spark the imagination and allow for current generations to interpret history and how previous cultures and people once lived. It's important that we use historic places and historic neighborhoods as tools of enlightenment and tools of education, teaching not only Harrisburgers, but visitors and tourists to understand the complex past of the capital city and how it impacts those who will come after us, who inhabit these places in the future. So overall, historic preservation is a very wide topic that impacts a variety of issues in Harrisburg, such as affordable housing, environmental justice, and things that need to be addressed. And through historic preservation, it can be a tool to address these systemic problems.
Well, thanks for that great answer, Frank. One of the characteristics of Harrisburg, Moman was scrolling through the map there from the end of the 19th century, is that we do have so much historic housing stock. It's still standing in the city of Harrisburg. It's something of a double-edged sword in the sense that our housing stock is very old in the city and requires preservation and requires constant maintenance. But on the other hand, it is very attractive. There are it brings people to the city. I can tell you one of the reasons we moved to Harrisburg was in part being just overwhelmed with the beauty of the Shipoke neighborhood, and we're going to talk about our historic districts here in a minute. But the ability to live in a Victorian row house with the high ceilings and the slate mantel pieces and all of the details was pretty incredible. And unlike the sort of sometimes the sort of characterless modern architecture that you see in a lot of suburban developments. So our architecture in the city defines us. And so let's talk now about our districts, because we have a number of historic districts in the city of Harrisburg. What are they? Where are they? And what does it mean to be part of a historic district?
So the city has 6 municipal historic districts: Uptown, Midtown, Fox Ridge, Harrisburg, Shipoke, and Allison Hill. And there are 5 national historic districts, and I'll differentiate these in a minute. There's Uptown, Downtown, Mount Pleasant, Midtown, and Harrisburg. Most of the historic districts are situated along the river wards, as they are the oldest and higher density parts of the city. And of course, Allison Hill, which is the oldest neighborhood, which expanded away from the downtown center of the city. And I'd like to differentiate between the type of historic district. So municipal historic districts are those which are regulated by the city ordinance, and are regulated by the Harrisburg Architectural Review Board. These are the districts that are regulated through the historic district regulations and through through the historic district guidelines, which we'll get to in a minute. National historic districts are not regulated by the city. These are districts certified by the State Historic Preservation Office and the National Park Service for their character defining features and streetscapes that contribute to the story of not only Pennsylvania, but the story of our country. So these are regulated through, like I said, the National Park Service, and the city does not have control over the exterior alterations that occur in these districts, unless there's a federal funding involved, but that's a whole nother topic. And for those who live in historic districts, municipal historic districts, it's important to understand that you live in a particularly interesting neighborhood and setting that deserves to be preserved, and that's why these boundaries exist, because these are unique neighborhoods. They have character defining features that only exist in Harrisburg, and once if these weren't protected, these neighborhoods would drastically change, and it's important that this feeling of sense of community and belonging is preserved in these districts.
Yeah, thanks. And I guess we could also mention it is possible as well to have individually listed historic properties that maybe aren't within a district. Can you talk about how a property can get listed?
So currently, there are individually listed properties on the National Register of Historic Places. Largely, these are honorary designations for individual properties. So one would work with the State Historic Preservation Office, and probably it would be in their best interest to work with an architectural historian or a historic preservation specialist to do the paperwork, to submit the paperwork to the State Historic Preservation Office, and they either recommend it's eligible for listing on the National Register or it's not eligible listing on the National Register. And in turn, the State Historic Preservation Office sends this paperwork to the National Park Service, who then either concurs with the SHPO on their finding of eligibility or not, and then it would be listed if they find that to be true, based on the characteristics of the property, its association with historic events, or people, particular craftsmanship, and so on. So that's the primary way that an individual could have their property listed on the National Register. And currently, there aren't any ways that there is a municipal landmark system. That's another way that in the future there could be for individuals, but we currently don't have that program. But it's a possibility in the future.
And we also have our wonderful sort of historical marker and trail system throughout the city, and which recently resulted in the latest marker at Jackson Square, where we tragically lost the Jackson House Hotel. But that's another way that we try and celebrate some of our structures and buildings and neighborhoods. Let me go off script for a minute and just try and personalize this. Do you have a favorite one or two historic structures in the city that really interest you and inspire you?
That's a good question. One of my favorite buildings in the city is the Haldeman Hawley Mansion at 27 North Front Street. It was constructed by Stephen Hills in 1812, and it was recently purchased by the Dauphin County Library System to expand their operations for the library. This historic structure is a federal style townhouse, which was fairly uncommon in Harrisburg at the time. It was constructed for its permanent, it's brick construction. It's very ornate ceilings and fireplace mantles. So it's a very good example of permanent architecture in the early period of Harrisburg's history. I also really enjoy the architecture of the old Bishop McDevitt School. And currently that's being adaptively reused. So that's a successful historic preservation story. Its collegiate kind of Gothic architectural style is from the 20th century. and it's very impressive in terms of its permanence and its materials used and how the designer designed that school to be used for education, and now it will breathe a new life into the 21st century.
Yeah, and I'll put a plug in as well for, I mean, of course, there's the Capitol, which is one of the most beautiful capitals anywhere in the country, and is really an extraordinary place to visit. And I think there are residents that probably haven't taken one of the public tours of the Capitol who really should. And it's amazing. Obviously, we'll have to get past the pandemic to have those tours really up and operating again. That's amazing. The John Harris Mansion's a truly fascinating structure too, because it combines the sort of colonial roots of Harrisburg with the Victorian, expansion of Simon Cameron, and that's a fun place to visit. But these buildings are, they're in every neighborhood, and oftentimes, as you mentioned to begin with, just learning more about your own house or your own structure can be the light in of itself. I'll also recommend a book. I'll recommend Ken Fru's Building Harrisburg as being an incredible resource on the architecture and the history of the city, especially from the perspective of some of the great architects who helped build many of these structures. All right, let's turn now to what has been a monumental task for you, which is to update and develop new historic district design and preservation guidelines for the city. I've got a copy of this right here, which I'll show to the camera if Momin wants to pan over here. We're going to be releasing this for a discussion soon. Walk us through what are the guidelines? Why did they need to be updated? And what do people need to know?
Yeah, it was definitely, and it still is definitely, a monumental task to update the historic district design guidelines. When I first dove into it, I had no idea where to start. But with persistence and guidance from the HARB and from the staff here in the Planning Bureau, was able to persist through it. But the Historic District Guidelines are a technical guide outlining the recommended procedures and methods to preserve historic architecture and streetscapes in the city of Harrisburg. The appropriateness of changes in historic districts can often be subjective without delineated and objective standards. Therefore, design guidelines standardize these recommended procedures based on historic preservation practices and objective reason. The guidelines outline the city's historic district regulations and give guidance on how to navigate the HARB, the Harrisburg Architectural Review Board, and the application process. It's important to update these guidelines because the existing guidelines are from 2009 and are quickly aging. Even though 2009 does not sound that long ago, it's important to update publicly utilized documents so that they're comprehensive and include the most updated and relevant information for historic preservation, for materials, and appropriate recommended procedures. The guidelines have more information and help answer more specific questions regarding historic preservation. And additionally, updating the guidelines is a clear and present investment into the city's historic preservation program. It's an outward expression of how we are actively caring about the program and investing in historic preservation through our historic districts.
Thanks, and we're going to get to Khalid in just a minute, and she can talk a little bit about this from HARB's perspective. But what are the next steps in implementing the guidelines? What's the process? What can people expect moving forward?
So the next steps in implementing the guidelines involve the Planning Bureau right now is in the editing process of the guidelines. Currently, it's a draft document, and it is currently being edited by myself and by the other staff here in the Planning Bureau, including Planning Director Jeffrey Knight and Planner Jacob Bowen. We are all collaborating to ensure that the document is as comprehensive as possible and includes all the relevant information. Once editing is complete through this process, the document will be publicly available on the city's website hopefully in the first week of March is the goal. And thereafter on March 11th and March 18th, there will be a public webinar presentations to discuss these new guidelines, and will be followed by public discussion on the guidelines, and taking questions and answers and from the public regarding the guidelines. So it looks like hopefully we're moving along pretty good, and hopefully will be a city council vote on the document maybe in May.
Great. So more to come. We wanted to begin getting the word out there about this, about the process. Keep watching Community Conversations on Facebook Live, and we'll update folks about the information sessions, and eventually about City Council will take them up. So thanks, Frank. Thanks for giving us an overview. I'm turning now to Khalid Tennis, who is a member of the Harrisburg Architectural Review Board, the most recent member of the board, just being appointed this past year. Khalid, it's nice to see you. Let's start with very basically, you know, what is the Historic Architecture Review Board? You've gotten to experience this firsthand, and you know, what's its purpose and what's its function?
Well, first, Mr. Mayor, thanks for inviting me to participate in this, and thank you, Frank, for being such a great leader in historic preservation. I really appreciate the poetry with which you talk about historic preservation. So the function of HARB is essentially to preserve the historic and beautiful walkability of the city of Harrisburg. And it is poetry, like Frank said. You know, without that sort of urban landscape and preserving its beauty and honoring the character of the buildings we have and all of its architectural details, without a HARB to do that, I don't think there's a good chance that a lot of those beautiful details, like the cornices and the woodwork and the ironwork and the copper bays and all those beautiful details that we all get to enjoy, and maybe we can't even name them, but without the HARB, I don't know that you would still see those. I think they get covered up, they get painted over, they'd get, you know, they'd fall down like the Jackson House. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, so as mentioned, you are the newest member of HARB. What has been, you know, let's personalize it. What sort of cases have you heard? What has been your experience up to this point?
Well, one of the cases we heard is one of Frank's favorite buildings, the library system's renovation of that structure Frank was talking about at 27 North Front. That was one of the cases that we heard. We did not meet in January, and our February meeting is postponed till next week. So we haven't heard a whole lot of cases on my watch so far.
Right. You are really new to HARB. Now, you live in a historic district. Which district is it, and what attracted you to the current home?
I live in Midtown, and I love my block. It's one of those blocks where ultimately every house is brick. It doesn't have like an extra surface on it. And if you review Frank's guidelines, you'll see like the importance of preserving that facade. Every house on my block has brickwork, and it has wood cornices, and it's an all row house block, and almost every house has a brick sidewalk. Great.
And for people watching, can you tell us a little bit about some of the other members that are currently on HARB? We're going to, as I said in the beginning, some of this is a bit of an advertisement because we have an open position, and we're hoping that somebody watching this show today may want to apply. But what other districts are sort of represented on the HARB board, and what are the sort of backgrounds for some of your colleagues?
I'm very new to the HARB, and we haven't had a session in person yet. We've only had sessions on Zoom since I joined. So Frank would be best to answer that, because I haven't actually met all the members of the HARB or actually seen them on the video.
And well, how about this? Well, okay, Frank, we'll jump in. But in terms of backgrounds for some of the members on the HARB, or if people are watching this at home and saying, well, should I get involved? What sort of background do you need aside from living in a historic district and caring deeply about the history? Tell us a little bit about the makeup of the board.
Well, like I said, I don't
Well,
know.
I directed that to Frank. Yeah, no, sure.
With the open seat, if you're interested in being part of a group that cares about future generations, then HARB would be a really good fit for you. If you live in a historic district, and I'm sure after this you could reach out to Frank to see, if you live in a historic district, and he would let you know. Frank and I had talked about when I first joined. I'm from Midtown. I think there's a couple other members who might also be in Midtown, but we talked about Allison Hill as a district where there are no HARB members representing that historic district. I think it would be great for the HARB and for the city if there were residents of every district, because like Frank said, each district has its own character and its own details that deserve preservation and care.
Great. And Frank, do you want to add to that? And specifically for the Allison Hill district, can we discuss the boundaries a little bit so people know where that is?
Yeah, I mean, Khalid definitely did a good job answering that. The majority of our members on the HARB are from the River Ward districts, including Midtown, Harrisburg. Primarily, those two districts are heavily represented in the HARB, and we'd like to get some more representation on the board, primarily from Allison Hill. Which in terms of geography, it's a bit of an outlier in terms of away from the river, but architecturally it's significant. It has beautiful Queen Anne architecture and row homes. But the boundaries of Allison Hill are Derry, primarily Derry, Summit, and Mulberry. So it's kind of a triangle, as you saw on the map there. It's very small. But nonetheless, people there are very passionate about their neighborhood, and I've visited quite a few times. And just to introduce myself, talk to residents, and it would be great to have one of the residents of Allison Hill submit their information to be considered for the open spot on the board.
Yeah, thanks. And, that's an area sometimes referred to currently as Mulder Square, the combination of Mulberry and Derry. It's an area where we've seen a lot of infill investment. The Housing Authority has constructed a number of new affordable housing projects on empty lots to infill and to hopefully help buttress the existing historic structures. It's an area of the city with a lot of character, and one where we're going to be seeing additional infrastructure development, new sidewalks, there's a new roundabout planned for the intersection. A new Harrisburg's second green alleyway is planned for this area, and that's all coming up in the new year. Kaylee, let's go back to you. Just to walk viewers through, and I realize you've only had one or two meetings here, but walk viewers through what happens at a typical meeting, and how the process works.
Well, it's a really exciting time to join HARB because of Frank's preservation guidelines. It's really comprehensive look at all the different details that we're going to be looking at in HARB. And so essentially what occurs is that there's an application process, and every month except for January, the HARB reviews the different cases that come up for review. So people submit their applications, and then Frank reviews them first off and looks at their certificate of appropriateness and compares it to the guidelines, and he gives his recommendations. And then each case gets a hearing, which literally means that we listen to what folks have to say about what they're looking to change. We review the materials, we review the methods, and We look at, what's acceptable, and we look at precedent. So a lot of times the material will be, a new thing on the market. And sometimes it's difficult to, Frank, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's sort of like you look for something that's an appropriate substitute. A really good example is slate, because you can't go out and get new slate that's exactly like the old slate. You might not want it because it'll chip and it won't maintain.
Yeah,
that's your question.
Well, here, let me jump in, and yeah, I'll direct this to you, Frank. There is a perception sometimes by members of the public, that historic preservation is going to be too expensive. It's, to do things in kind often just is beyond the budget of the average household. And I know that HARB and your design guidelines go out of their way to try and create options for folks. So you want to talk about how maybe older perceptions of historic preservation as just being for elites maybe is not what is embodied in the current design guidelines?
Yeah, cost has been an issue, and like you have said, that's definitely an old association with historic preservation, that it's elite, that it's bureaucratic. I would disagree. I mean, some things sure could be a little more expensive than traditional materials, but think about the return on investment into a property. The HARB is always open and willing to be amendable to the context of a property, the context of the individual applying for the alteration or the specific change on a property. And anybody that's interested in doing work in a historic district can always contact me to discuss options that they have. I can always give you recommendations on types of materials that you could use, and new in kind substitutes for historic materials as well. And some of those have to go through HARB, and others don't necessarily have to go through HARB because they have been administratively approved. But it's very based on context of the building, the context of where the building is, and the existing materials that are on the building and their condition. So the HARB and the Planning Bureau are always open to new ideas, new methods, new materials that are appropriate for historic buildings. And the HARB is always willing to have an open ear and an open heart to listen to people's stories and their projects. So the idea that it's expensive is not necessarily true. And it's important to understand that we want existing historic materials to be repaired rather than replaced. That's a big thing. We want these to be repaired as much as possible, and people have the perception that they need to replace everything. It's usually not the case. You can usually be successful by repairing historic wooden elements, which often deteriorate. So usually it just takes a phone call or an email to the Planning Bureau to discuss your options. And I'm always open for conversations.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. And Khalid, you mentioned slate. I can tell you on our house, which is just outside one of the municipal historic districts, we put on a sort of replacement style synthetic slate, which you can't tell the difference. And it is, it's beautiful. It works well, and it's an example of an alternative product. I know there are a lot of interesting composite products for windows, some of which are very appropriate, and oftentimes they can lead to greater energy efficiency. There can be a savings there, and maybe it is about simply repairing, which is a much more sustainable process than replacing. I know people we live in a culture where we seem to easily be wanting to replace everything, but if we can preserve what we have, make it last longer, it's better for the environment, it's better for everyone. So Khalid, we're going to get to some questions here in a second, but let me ask you just what I asked Frank. Do you have a favorite historic structure in Harrisburg, or a hidden gem that you love walking by every day in your neighborhood? How would you answer that?
I do love the Capitol. I know you mentioned the Capitol. The Capitol is not only beautiful from the outside, Um, but it's beautiful from the inside, and it's beautiful from so many different vantage points in the city. Because of the rotunda and the roof and the sculptures and just, like you both said, the history and the stories and the way that it's an anchor for our urban landscape. And it really is sort of like laid out in the city planning, so that you can see it from so many different places and appreciate it from so many different places in the city.
That's right. It really defines our skyline, and no matter where you are, and it has so many angles that are really iconic. Well, thank you. And Momin, any questions from our viewers today?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I'll toss this one to Frank. How do I know if my home is designated as a historic property? Does it just go? Does it just do with the age of the structure?
That's a good question. So to understand whether or not your property is in a municipal historic district, we have a map, a map on the city website, on the planning website, that you can use to understand where your property is within these municipal historic districts. That's the best tool I would recommend. You could type in your address and it'll pop up on the layers and state whether you're in Midtown or Shipoke or Allison Hill, and it'll tell you if you're in a municipal historic district or otherwise. If anybody ever has any questions of whether their property is in a historic district or if it's historic, you can always reach me at fagrumbine@harrisburgpa.gov, or give me a call at 717-255-3079, and I'm happy to help anybody about their historic properties.
Yeah, Momin, I'll just add, there's of course a difference between being within a historic district and having a historic property. Far more historic properties in the city of Harrisburg than districts. And even, the potential, and there has been talk of maybe creating a new district or expanding the district guidelines and that sort of thing. So that's maybe a topic for another show. But I learned just in researching City Hall that our current City Hall is a remarkable example of modern brutalist architecture, and that building was built in 1982. So it's not like 100 years is the cutoff. It is they're examples of modern architecture in the city, which are tremendously interesting and important and worth preserving. So I encourage everybody to learn more about their home. There's a lot of great resources available. It can be very rewarding and interesting, and I think Frank is the man to help. So reach out to the city and visit the planning department at the harrisburgpa.gov website.
Mm-hmm. And a follow-up to Frank on that note, and it might be on that same page on the website. Where can I find a listing of historic properties near me?
Cool. And like the mayor said, there's a big difference. There are a far more number of historic properties in the city relative to the number of properties in municipal historic districts. So a listing, there are no public current listings, I suppose, of historic properties in a particular area other than the map I've mentioned, which I believe is under the Planning Bureau's website, the Planning Bureau portal under the City of Harrisburg's website. So the question is sometimes difficult based on without specific context. I wish I could answer it a little bit better, but more context is needed to tailor that question to a specific property somewhere.
And Momin, a lot of people may be watching and wondering, how old is their house? Maybe they want to know that, and there are a variety of ways to determine that. There are a number of great historical atlases and maps that were produced for Harrisburg over the centuries that show the growth and development of the city. There are records in Dauphin County, which deed records and other things which show when houses were constructed and built. All of these records, some of which we're talking about are in the city archives, but others are publicly searchable and accessible online. I'd say in short, aside from reviewing the information on the districts and being able to type your address in on the website, best to reach out to Frank, and he'll get back with some good advice on how to do that research.
Okay. And I think that's all the questions we have for today.
Okay, great. Well, it's 1 o'clock, so that was terrific. I want to thank you both, Khalid and Frank. That was a great conversation. I want to remind people watching, we are interested in filling our seats on the board. We should probably say it's usually a monthly meeting. I don't think it's necessarily a huge amount of work, but there is some prep work that goes into reviewing the case files on a monthly basis. We encourage you to apply, and you can again reach out to Frank. He will pass along interested parties to me. Usually there's a brief interview process, and then the name gets sent to City Council for confirmation. It can be pretty painless, and we'd love to have you, if you're watching and interested, volunteer to become a part of our city. HARB is one of many volunteer boards that we have. Others of our boards have openings, so depending on what your particular interests are, maybe it's not specifically in historic architecture, but it is in planning, for instance, or in other aspects of the city. Get in touch and let us know your availability, because we want to broaden the conversation and we want to keep everybody well informed and a part of the process. So thanks to you guys for a great show on historic preservation. We appreciate you watching at home. We've got some very interesting topics here coming up in the weeks ahead here on Community Conversations. We're going to try and vary it so to keep you fully up to date with all the different things that are going on at the city. It was nice to give some exposure to our planning department this morning. So hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'm Mayor Eric Pappenfuss saying stay safe, and we'll see you next week at noon on Friday on Facebook Live.